I have been a Laura Purcell fan pretty much from the start. She's a British author who broke new ground in the gothic and horror genres with her book The Silent Companions, which I really loved. And she followed that with The Corset, which to this day I still think is probably her best novel. The Corset really is an incredible work of historical gothic terror where nothing terrifying ever happens, and that's what real terror is. Then we had Bone China, another classic piece of gothic horror, and The Shape of Darkness, which was something a little bit different, kind of a conspiracy murder mystery thing set during the winter in Bath. Beautiful setting, conjured up gorgeous imagery, and I liked the multiple character perspectives of that novel. Now we have this, The Whispering Muse. And with this novel, Laura Purcell has done it again, as she always does. While I could rank her novels, what's important is the fact that she always brings it. She never disappoints. Her books are always at least great, if not incredible. And The Whispering Muse speaks to me because I love theatre. I go to theatre shows a lot. I studied theatre. I was an acting student. And setting a book in the Victorian period in London's West End at a theatre with smatterings of Greek mythology and Shakespeare all twisted into this gnarled thing is gorgeous. I will say right now at the beginning that if you love gothic fiction, if you love horror, but really more importantly, if you love the gothic, this is a true gothic masterpiece. This is in so many ways the most gothic thing she's written, because Laura Purcell toes that line between gothic and horror. And the waters, when it comes to these genres, are very murky. It's difficult to separate them, and we shouldn't always have to. And a lot of novels are both. And a lot of her novels are both. But I would argue that this one really is a novel that understands the traditions and the history of the Gothic. And I'll get into that as I explain the novel. So what's it about? As I said, The Whispering Muse is set in the Victorian period. Our protagonist is Jenny, a young woman in her 20s who, until now, has been working as a housemaid. The eldest brother of her family was working as a painter at a West End theatre, but he ran off with an actress. And at the beginning of the novel, the wife of the owner of the theatre has reached out to Jenny and asked for an audience with her. So Jenny's on her way to this woman's house. Her name is Mrs. Dyer. Jenny's not looking forward to this audience. She thinks that she and her family are going to be punished for what her brother did. Instead, Mrs. Dyer offers Jenny a job. She explains that the theatre has this wonderful new actress called Lilith. It's a stage name. But Lilith is an up-and-coming great of the theatre. She's going to be the West End's new big-name actor. But Mrs. Dyer doesn't like her, doesn't trust her, and wants Jenny to infiltrate Lilith's world, get close to her, work beside her, and just report back on her. And so Jenny becomes Lilith's dresser. She fixes any issues with her costumes, and she gets her ready for every night's performance. Because she's being paid so well, and because she's been given this really exciting new job offer, she feels indebted to Mrs. Dyer, and so she does her job well, including sleuthing and being underhanded. But Lilith isn't dumb, she knows what's happening here. And so we have a protagonist who is struggling with her responsibilities, struggling with the ethics of it all. She's kind of making friends with Mrs. Dyer, but she's also making friends with Lilith. At first she despises her, she sees her the way that Mrs. Dyer sees her. And then over time she starts to warm to her and sees a lot more to her than what initially meets the eye, as is so often the case when we meet people, and we judge them too quickly and too harshly, and then we soften to them over time. That aspect to the novel felt very human, and especially the fact that it takes a while. Her softening to Lilith doesn't take place until about halfway through. At first, Lilith is the villain of the piece, and it feels pretty clear-cut. But then, the edges get sanded away, things get revealed. Empathy creeps into the novel. And that's something that is very subtly Gothic. The idea that we empathize with people we don't expect to empathize with. We hate people we don't expect to hate. Personalities and relationships get twisted up, and the usual dynamics and formulas just don't apply when it comes to the Gothic. That's part of its beauty. And Laura Purcell really understands that and executes it here in The Whispering Muse. Now, of course, this is a Gothic horror, and there has to be a supernatural element, and I mentioned Greek mythology at the beginning. The Greek mythology-infused supernatural element actually gets thrown at us kind of rudely, in a really impactful, dramatic, and unsettling way that knocks you off balance. Before Lilith, there was a great actor who dies at the beginning of the novel, and Jenny sees him die. He's the theatre's great actor. He is beloved and renowned, etc., etc. And during a particular scene, on stage in front of an audience, he suddenly has some kind of a aneurysm or something happen to him. He starts to cough up blood, he seizes, and he dies there on stage. It's bloody, it's gory, it's sudden, and it's striking. And it comes to light very quickly, and this is given away in the blurb, so I'm not spoiling anything, that this man may have been cursed by the muse Melpomene. Melpomene was the Greek muse of tragedy, specifically. And this man had a pocket watch that he carried around with him everywhere. And there is some tie between this man, the muse Melpomene, and the pocket watch. Characters in the novel begin to think, or already think, that he made a deal with this muse to have her gift him with incredible talent when it comes to acting, specifically in tragedies, and that the muse may have been captured within this pocket watch. But it's a curse, and he has now died. And that curse, or gift, depending on how you look at it, is going to pass on to Lilith, or already has done. Lilith has the pocket watch, and Mrs. Dyer wants it. And as the novel goes on, more and more tragedies, more and more deaths are going to occur. Are they coincidences? Can they be rationally and logically explained away? Or is this curse real? And if it is real, what does Melpomene want? And is it even her? If it isn't her, who or what is it? What does Lilith stand to gain? Why does Mrs. Dyer want the watch? What's happening? There are a lot of questions to ask, a lot of threads and strands that you can tug at. And at the centre of it all, you've got Jenny, a clueless person who doesn't know much about the theatre, who has joined recently, who is being pulled at like a doll from either side by Mrs. Dyer and Lilith, and she just wants to do a good job and earn her money, and make some friends and look after the people she's coming to love and understand. But this is so often the case with a lot of fiction, especially grand genre fiction, especially horror, where the protagonist is underwater. They are out of their depth. They are drowning in all of this atmosphere, in all of these events, and that can leave them feeling a little bit underdeveloped, where they don't have much personality, they don't have a lot of agency, they don't have a lot of gusto. They can kind of just get pushed around by the plot. Jenny's different. I actually appreciate just how much aggression there is behind her eyes. You get to see a lot of fire in her as the book goes on. She makes choices, she has agency, she betrays people, she acts underhandedly, she makes difficult, courageous, risky choices. Jenny actually is a character. She's quite powerful, and I really appreciate that. I also appreciate that this is a cast made up mostly of women in the theatre, especially in the Victorian period. Now, obviously, the author is a woman, and the Gothic genre is very much attached to women writers. Most of the great Gothic authors have been women, but it's just lovely to see this cast of women at each other's throats, casting curses and making deals with Greek muses. It's really fun. And, as I said at the beginning, because I am a theatre fanatic, because If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio is now one of my favourite novels ever, because in part of its theatre connection. This novel left a particular impact on me. I adored the theatre setting. I love all the references to Shakespeare, to Greek tragedies, to Marlowe. Obviously Faust and Dr. Faustus, which are two different plays, both play a part in this because it's about making deals with devils, or things, people, muses, gods, stuff. It's a Gothic tragedy that calls upon the history of theatre, the traditions of theatre, especially when it comes to Greek tragedy. It's something that understands the power of theatre and the way that theatre's traditions can be woven into a narrative. When you really stop and think about the history of the Gothic, the history of tragic theatre, they overlap a lot. especially when it comes to their themes, their settings, their morals, their characters. There's a lot of overlap between tragic theatre and the Gothic. So it makes sense to set a very Gothic novel in a theatre full of tragedy, both in terms of the genres that are being put on and the things that actually happen within the story. Tragedy prevails, I guess is the word. Tragedy prevails. I'm so impressed. A Gothic novel by one of my favourite Gothic horror writers, set in a theatre where the Gothic themes, tropes and characters are all dialed up to 11. Perfect. Absolutely incredible. Laura Purcell really has outdone herself with this one. I'm really, really impressed. This is Gothic. This is the heights of modern Gothic. Awesome. Subscribe for books.